What are your last wishes when your time here on Earth comes to a close? Or is that something that you choose not to think about or even discuss? Well, my guest in this latest conversation on the Possibility Hub is Felicity Warner, the founder of the Soul Midwives Movement that teaches holistic and spiritual care for the end of life. Felicity's view is that everyone should be treated as the most loved person in the world when they're going through their transition of consciousness. It's said that if you really want to know and understand life, you also need to understand death. Or rather than call it death, I like to call it a transition of consciousness. Yet it's a topic that's often avoided. And last year, my mother turned 90, and I noticed that she wanted to speak about her passing. And my brother and I kind of like shied away from the conversation and moved the conversation in a different direction. But I decided to do something about it. And I came across a book by my guest today, Felicity, and it was called the Soul Midwives Handbook. And it was so good that I decided also to do the introductory course, which I really enjoyed and found so valuable. So thank you, Felicity, for agreeing to be here on the Possibility Hub today. And the first question I want to ask you is, why do you think so many people avoid the subject of death or even thinking about death when it's a given?
Yes, Carol, that's a really good question to start with. And also thank you so much for inviting me to come along and chat today. It's a great question. I think a lot of people have quite a deep primal fear of death. I think this is partly a cultural thing that we're brought up to think that death is terrible and that death is the end, and it brings nothing but sorrow and terribleness about it. And so I think that puts a lot of people off talking about death because they have such preconceived ideas. And I also think that people don't want to talk about death because they are a bit superstitious. They think if I talk about death, and especially my own death and plans for my death, the inevitable will happen. Something, it might even happen quicker than I thought. And it's so surprising talking to people as I do about death all the time, all day, every day, it feels like at times, that so many people say that to me. They say, I don't really want to talk about it because I fear it's just going to jump out and get me. So even making a will frighten people at times. And I think really one of the parts of my work is to talk about death, is to bring it out in the open and to say, come on, everybody, this, as you said, it is the one inevitable thing that's going to happen. And the more we talk about it, the more we begin to dissolve that fear, shed some light on it. And again, I love the word you use, transition, because that's exactly how I see death after all these years of working in it. It isn't a great finality. It isn't this terrible end. It is a transition into what I see as another form of consciousness. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, so really it's a celebration, and, you know, rather than this somber funeral that we create, it should be, and I know, speaking to some people who've had people pass over in their family recently, I'm just thinking of one in particular, and it sounded like what they created really was a celebration of their mother's life. And the music and everything was so done with such care, and she said she sees it as a blessing, really, that she had that time to spend with her mother and assist her in her transition. So I'm also curious, though, it's a strange thing, people may think, to be interested in, to sort of, I mean, you've written books, you run training programs, you go into care homes and nurses and work with nurses to sort of talk and open up this topic, which is, you know, often like, oh, mustn't speak about that. So what drew you to this work? Or was it the other way round?
I think it found me. I think it definitely found me. I mean, honestly, Carol, if you'd said to me, oh gosh, I don't know, many, many years ago when I was in my 20s, you will end up working with people at the end of life and you will be teaching people about how to care for people at the end of life, I would have been utterly astonished. You know, I was the original party girl, and I just did all sorts of joyful things. I had my little sports car, and I'd had a very wide circle of people, and life was on a completely different level. But actually, and this there were clues along the way, I think, because I was a very, very sensitive child. I was brought up by my grandmother. My parents divorced when I was 6. And I went to live with my grandmother, who again was very sensitive, but she embraced life 100%. She also in her day had been a bit of a party girl. And the residue of that, I'm afraid for her, was that she was very sociable, but she also loved a gin and tonic in the evening. And a sign of those times, she smoked like a chimney, and was terribly, terribly outgoing and funny and delightful. But sadly, she developed lung cancer, and did what so many people do, hid her head in the sand just like an ostrich. She had her diagnosis and decided that she would not even ever talk about it ever again, because she had been told it was incurable. So we were very, very, very close. And in the last year of her life, I began to look after her as she was less able to look after me. And she very sadly died when I was just 14. And we had had a very sweet year, her final year, of us sharing so many memories of her childhood and of her life. And I just used to listen to her telling me about all the exciting things she'd done, and we shared so much. And I'm sure that was part of her bringing her world to closure in a way, but also passing on all sorts of things about her life and her family life. And anyway, she died, and I saw her the night she died, and it was horrific. I couldn't believe the difference between where she was in this very old-fashioned old TB sanatorium. I mean, that lets you know how old and grim it was. It had shiny lino on the floor and strip lights above her bed, and there was nothing soft, there was nothing kind. It was very, very harsh. And I just remember thinking the difference between that very clinical environment and our home, which was so cozy and a little bit tatty around the edges, but you know, we had our cats, and there was always lovely food cooking, and there'd be music playing, you know. And I really, on that evening she died, thought, how on earth do we allow people to die in such terrible, gruesome environments, when really it felt as if the best place to be dying was at home and with your family around you. And that whole image and that evening stayed with me all my life. And even on that evening, I thought, one day I will do something about this. So as I was saying, if you then took me into my 20s, when that sort of thing was far from my mind, but it was still a very deep and inner part of myself. And I was a journalist, and loved hearing people's stories very much, and also I did have a real empathy when people were ill and were struggling, and I was able to listen. And I think listening is one of the biggest skills that we have as soul midwives, to sit and listen with no agenda and with no judgment and with no squeamishness about what we're listening to. I think is one of our mega skills, really, in sitting with the dying. And in my work as a journalist, I'd be working with women who were terminally ill, young women, the same age as I was then. So I was by this time in my early 30s, and I had young children, and these women also had young children, and they knew they were dying of breast cancer. And my writing was to really illustrate their journey, what they were going through, how it felt, how it felt on the inside, in an emotional way, rather than just their sort of medical journey. And I just, something inside me knew how to do that work, and I'm sure from having been with my grandmother that was a very important thing. So that's how I really came into doing the work. It grew very organically. I never sat with a sort of clipboard thinking, I will now do this, and then next year it'll be like that. It just grew. And I was very much a lone voice in the wilderness at the time, because there weren't really people who were, I suppose, feeling the need to support people on a sort of holistic basis in the way that I was beginning to. It was either you were ill and you went into a hospital or a hospice and died, or, you know, there wasn't really much sort of holistic support available, and there was no recognition of a need for that either. So as I say, I was very much a lone voice in the desert for a long time, but almost destiny had other plans for me. And the work evolved, really.
And I think many people think that the work is around nursing and that they need nursing experience, where that's actually not the case, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, you know, to have been alive in the world and to have suffered some of the sort of knocks and bruises that we get through living, and from having had children and having worked in our communities, those are the skills that really come in and are so vital, because they have enriched us and grown us as people. And when we're sitting with the dying, all those skills are the ones that we really need. So we're very different to nursing staff. We're not there, we don't give any pills or take blood pressure or anything like that, but we will sit, we will hold hands, we'll reassure, we'll soothe, we'll listen, and we do have some therapeutic skills that we're able to offer, and we do, but really it's about being a warm and tender-hearted human being sitting at the bedside of another human being who is in real need. That's what the skill is all about. And we have soul midwives. I love thinking about the spread of our community, because we have men as well as women, and that's really important to say, because I think a lot of people think, oh yeah, soul midwives, they're all going to be women, but in fact they're not. And we have probably 40 or so brilliant men who are soul midwives as well. So we have both sexes. We also have our youngest soul midwife is 23.
Wow.
And in fact, she is also a nurse, an oncology nurse, but she loves using her soul midwifery skills in addition to her nursing skills. She has said it's like the icing on the cake, because she gets to do very, very person-to-person centered work when she's using her soul midwifery skills. So we have her as our youngest, and then our oldest is a lady who was a birth midwife many, many years ago, and she's in her mid-80s now, and she does the work for all her friends and church community, because one by one they're all reaching the end of life, and she's the one that comes in and knows how to sit with them and help them through that transition process. So we are so varied. We have, yes, we do have doctors as well who are soul midwives, but we also have teachers and artists and musicians and all manner of people in between. So it's a very broad community indeed.
So your course has really evolved over the years based on the experience, and as people have come to realize that, you know, there really is a beauty and a humbleness in being able to be with somebody at that point of transition. And I know when I was going through the introductory course, we went through the different stages, and I'm absolutely certain, again, one of the things that, you know, interested me was, if you're seeing somebody go through that transition, you know, it's got to be an awakening also of your own consciousness and awareness of the different energies that are going on in that time. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the most mystical experiences that you've had that have kind of like, you know, really given your heart, you know, confirmation that, you know, there's more, that this is just a part, this physical form is just a part of the bigger picture?
Oh, Carol, I could spend hours telling you about some of the extraordinary mystical things that I have seen and heard, because those things show us really, again, that death is still a mystery. It's one of the great mysteries. And I even think we're not meant to know everything about it.
Yeah.
You know, we are meant to be in awe of it slightly, and to enter it with no absolute sense of outcome. You know, we have to go in without knowing everything. But having said that, my word, the things I have seen have been extraordinary. And I'm just going to think of a couple of examples. Yes, you mentioned the stages of dying, and that's interesting because I think not many people, unless they've been on a course or they've looked after a dying loved one, would actually know. But there are 4 very distinct phases in the dying process that people will go through, in their physical and their emotional and their psychospiritual stages. Once you know them, then it all makes sense. Everything you've ever seen with a dying loved one all begins to make sense. But there's one stage that we talk about, which is the fire stage. All these stages relate back to the elements, but the fire stage is sort of fairly close towards the end, and it's a stage where people are restless and they can be rather fidgety and angry, maybe lashing out. And it can be quite a frightening stage to see your loved one in, because it looks as if they're really losing control and that they're in a state of despair and anxiety. But one of the things that happens in the fire stage is that people who are dying seem to see things that are outside the normal radar width, or hear things. And they'll often say extraordinary things, like quite prophetic things, like next Thursday, I will die at lunchtime. And literally, that is exactly what happens. It's almost as if they step out of normal human time and step into a bigger framework of time. But I remember sitting with one elderly gentleman, and he was in the fire stage, and I was sitting with his daughter as well, and he was very restless and very anxious and very distressed. And I was just doing my best to reassure his daughter that actually this would pass, all would be well. And suddenly, from all the lashing about he was doing, and the moaning and the sort of mumbling, he suddenly stopped, and he sat back in bed, and he smiled this beautiful smile. We both thought, wow, what's happening now? And he just looked at the bottom of the bed, and he came out with a name. I think it was Alfred. I looked at the daughter, and she looked at me, and she said, oh my goodness, she said, that is the name of his horse. And he was a rag and bone man. And this horse and he used to go all up and down the streets collecting rag and bone. This is years ago, and she said, that's his horse. Now that horse had come to take him home. It felt like the recognition and the peace and the calm of him just saying this. So people often close to death will see something that really makes them feel that it is okay to go for the next part of the journey. Often it's people's relatives will come, relatives who have long since passed. But this was just wonderful, the fact that it was his horse that came for him. So that was a lovely one. And another very quick story, I was sitting with a lady who nobody knew why she was still alive. This was at the hospice. She wasn't eating, she wasn't drinking, she had very advanced cancer, but she was just in a sort of state of hanging on in no man's land. Now, the reason for this was that her husband hadn't been in to see her. He couldn't face coming into the hospice, because in his heart, that meant he knew that she was actually going, and he couldn't bring himself to. And for 10 days, I sat with her every day, and she was completely non-verbal. She couldn't talk. She just lay there with her eyes closed. And then eventually, a neighbor brought her husband in. He just thought, I will go. And he sat and held her hand, and she woke up and she smiled and she held his hand back. And within half an hour, she died. And again, you know, people die when the time is absolutely right and ready. And the fact he'd come in and she'd been unconscious really for those 10 days, she knew exactly, she was waiting. So I don't know if we call those exactly mystical experiences, but they do show us, I think, that the mind, body, spirit has got a sense of everything that's going on during dying, and has got some control up to a point as well. You know, and so many people, this is another thing that happens very commonly, they'll be sitting around the bedside of a dying person, vigiling for days and days and days, and then the doctor might say, could you all just step outside? I just need to ask you something, or explain something, or perhaps they go for a meal, or they go to the loo, whatever. And when they leave the room, the dying loved one dies. Now that happens so often.
I've heard that.
And relatives are distraught, you know, oh, how can that have happened the minute we left mum on her own? We weren't with her. In fact, I really feel that sometimes to die, we need to be able to die with nobody sitting around us. That we have just got to be able to go without that sort of attachment of people holding on and saying, we love you so much. It's just when they've gone, it's okay, we can go off, you know, and now is the time to die. So these are the sort of things, Carol, that we don't talk about enough in society. Yes. If we only shared a few more of these very quite quirky stories about things that happen, I don't think that people would be as frightened of death as they are, because when you start to understand more and see the things that I've been privileged to see over all these years, you are left with such a sense of grace when a death has occurred, and especially a good death. You know, a good death has a healing effect on everybody. So it's important that we have these conversations like we're having now.
Yes, totally. And, you know, when you said the timing and appointment time, I was reminded of a friend of mine whose mother passed some years back. And I guess she was the one who was a little bit more aware in the family. And they thought her mother was close to death. And her mother said, oh, no, my appointment's not till next Wednesday.
There
exactly
we are.
As you said, she knew exactly, and that's exactly when she went. And then there was another example I wanted to share, that another friend recently held space for her mother was passing over, and managed to get back to the UK and spend the last, I don't know, 6 weeks, 2 months with her mother. And something had come through that I saw. It was a lovely advice around passing over, and I'm sure this will resonate with you. It was, and I didn't send it to my friend because I didn't know how she'd take it and where she was, but I did send it on one day, and it was basically that when the person passes over, don't rush off on the phone or go and call the doctor or anything. Stay present and just spend some time you know, while the spirit transits, so to speak.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I sent that to her. It was beautifully written. And I sent it to her, and unbeknown to me, her mother passed over the next day. She shared that little gem of advice with her sisters and brother. And so those of them who were there when their mother made her transition, and it was at home, they went, put the kettle on, came back with a cup of tea and sat and stayed. And I felt that was so important when I see so many people, when somebody has passed, a parent, a sibling, just get on with life. You know, back to work the next day. I remember some other clients coming, and they were brother and sister, they were siblings. And what came out during the session was that they'd never, you know, they'd gone overseas because they went back to their home country for the funeral and their father's passing, and then came straight back here and carried on working. And this was a year or so later. And I said, you haven't taken time to honor your father, to, you know, and this is what society does, isn't it? We want to busy, let's get on with things, do, rather than this is definitely a time to be.
Definitely. And it's a time within the time. I always say to people, go slowly when you've just lost someone and when someone has just died. Go slowly, calm right down. Take the time to really honor that moment, because it's a very special time. And, you know, to be able to sit with somebody who's just recently passed, to be able to talk to them in a gentle, beautiful way, it's so healing again for everyone. And I'm a great advocate for this with all the families I work with. When the end has actually come, I always say, okay, this is just so special now. Would you like me to sit with you while we sit here, or let me go out and put the kettle on? But just take your time. And we really encourage people, and it's not always possible, obviously, if you're in a very hot country, but if it's possible in a cooler country, to actually don't rush to have that body removed. Maybe even have the person with you at home for a day or 2 days, if that's possible. And again, this really adds such a different dimension to the whole grieving process. So I think it's really important, definitely.
Wow, that's interesting you say that, because a few years ago I would have thought, oh God, that's really creepy. I don't
Yeah.
think. But when you think about, you know, the bigger picture, it makes total sense, you know, because I would imagine the spirit has still some attachment to the body, the space, the people and everything. Now, you also work with sacred oils
Yes, I
to
do.
assist in the process. Can you tell us a little about how that works? Is it because, you know, the senses shut down in a certain way? Or what is it about the sacred oils that you use that helps? And I know these were mentioned even in the introductory course, certain oils that it's like, oh, this one's really great for this, or this one. And I just thought, wow, it makes me want to know more about them and
Oh,
how the sense of smell and those oils. I mean, I'm always burning incense anyway. And in the Middle East, here in the Middle East, it's frankincense and myrrh, which is
yes.
beautiful.
Oh, how lovely.
So
Yes.
how do you use sacred oils? And are there some
Okay.
specific ones you use that you can just share a few?
Yes, definitely. Oh, this is a real passion for me, because as soul midwives, we don't use any medicines at all. You know, that is beyond our remit. But we do have these real medicines of the soul, as I think of them. And in old ancient traditions, these sacred oils were always used in the care of the dying. And it's interesting that you were talking about, of course, working with, you know, frankincense and sandalwood, whatever, and incense. It was always a part of how we care for the dying. So I'm was very lucky to be taught this very ancient way of working, which dates way back to the temple times of Mary Magdalene and beyond. And so there are these specific oils. There aren't that many, but they have a real affinity with working with the dying. It's partly to do with the smell, but it's partly to do with their energetic frequency. So when I talk about that, it's a little bit in the same way that homeopathy works, or
Yes.
the flower remedies work. And what they do is the frequency of the oils harmonizes and rebalances the inner part of ourselves. So the inner core, if you like. And so there are 4 wonderful oils. Well, 5. No, I mean, I could talk about 20, but let's
Yeah, I was just going to say,
we'll just do 5 because we haven't got all day. But again, looking at those 4 stages of dying, there would be an oil to use for each of those stages to really calm and soothe the person as they go through that stage. For the first stage, which is the earth stage, we would use Mei Chang, which is a beautiful Chinese oil, smells very fresh, beautiful. For the next stage, which is the water stage, which is all about our inner selves and our emotions, we would use Ravensara. And then for the fire stage, which we talked about, where people can be very restless and agitated, we use an oil called Niaoli. And then for the air stage, when people are very close towards the end and their breath and breathing is very significantly changed, we use one of the most beautiful oils of all called Elemi. And it comes from the Far East, and its name comes from the fact that it connects heaven with earth. And I love that. It has this real kind of balance within it. So we use those oils usually on our own hands, and then we'll hold the hand of the dying person. So we sort of transmit the healing from the oil to the person. And then there is just one more oil to mention because it is so classic in this repertoire. It's spikenard, and it has a very strong smell, and it was the oil used by Mary Magdalene at the Last Supper. And if you remember, she anointed Jesus and then washed his feet with her hair. And so a lot of people have heard of spikenard, and it has this great affinity again with the dying. So we use that. But the effects of using these oils is extraordinary. You can really see people just dropping, relaxing, letting go. And they're so simple. So it's a great tool to have, really.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. And some of those names of oils I've actually never come across. I guess we're familiar with, all the
lavender and yes,
rosemary and those kind of ones. So to find these more unusual ones, I shall certainly look out for them as well. Now, this is the Possibility Hub. So I wanted to ask you, what possibilities do you think your work has opened up for people, for families, the families and the friends who have people maybe crossing over? What do you think this work and having someone like you, a soul midwife, help and support, not just the person who's making their transition, but also the family? What possibilities do you think that's opened up for them?
I think one of the biggest possibilities is that it brings the dying person back into our own circle of care again, because dying has become so medicalized in the last 50 or 60 years. And yet with the soul midwife approach, we're able to really empower loved ones to do this work again for their dying loved one. So instead of just handing our dying people over to medics to have high sort of clinical treatment, which has its place, of course, yes, but it's empowering people to give of themselves once more, and to reimagine how we do death and dying in the modern age. So I really hope that the possibility of this work and this offering is to really enable people to have that deep connection with those they love at the end of life, and that feels so important in this very busy, modern, chaotic age that we're living in, because when we're able to do this ourselves and make such a difference, it is so healing for everybody. So I really believe that.
And also, I think a soul midwife can be that bridge between, the things that families find it hard to say and yet want to say, and create that bridge which they may not have been able to create themselves, and having somebody else facilitate that, so that everyone is honored, and given time, the family, the person that's making their transition. Yeah, and I also loved one of the other words or languaging that you used, because communication is so important. You don't call them clients or patients, they're called friends. Yeah. And I think that's, because you do become very close. So I thought there were some very nice subtle shifts that make it I can think of nothing nobler and more honorable to be able to help or support somebody at that time, and the family as well. So final question is, what possibilities has this, we call it work, yet it's your spirit calling really to this, and what possibilities it's opened up for you? Because I know you've written a book, you've won so many awards, you go into care homes, hospitals, educating people. So it's not just training people, and raising awareness. There's so many layers to this as well. So what possibilities has it opened up for you, maybe your family and in your life, on this pathway, which you never would have dreamt of?
Yes, this extraordinary pathway. Gosh, Carol, what a question. It's quite hard to answer, but the possibilities for me, actually, there is one very striking one, and I only just thought of it as you were asking me. I was an only child, as I was explaining earlier, and went to live with my grandmother. And one of the things I always wished for was to have a bigger family. I felt always that I envied people who had lots of brothers and sisters. And in a way, for me, doing this work has opened out the possibility of having so many rich and deep and fantastic relationships with so many people. I've been privileged and honored to accompany people at their most vulnerable time, and to hold them with love, because the whole thing is based on love. It really, really is. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters. But what it's enabled me to do is to have an enormous family around me, because once I've worked with somebody, they will always be part of my family. And all my students as well are all part of my family. And I have people that I trained 15 years ago, and I still know everything about them that I ever knew when I knew them 15 years ago. And I love them dearly. We are a very big family. So in a funny way, that's what the possibility of doing this work really opened out for me, just being the center really of this really big and beautiful family who I love so much. So I think that's how I'm going to answer that. That doesn't sound too balmy.
No, not at all. And I want to thank you, because this has been such a rich, even I'd say nourishing conversation, which is strange when, we're talking about death and that transition of consciousness. And yet I hope it's sparked some curiosity in listeners and viewers to maybe reach out, have a look at some of your books, and which were excellent. And also to think about, it's an area that's going to touch us and our loved ones or friends sometime or other. So to be able to support another person, in a way that serves them and enhances your life, is really a beautiful, beautiful experience. So I thank you so much for accepting my invitation to be here and being so open to share. I've loved our conversation. I could speak to you for hours and hours and hours about all your experiences, and I know you could as well. But thank you so much. And I hope this recording will act as an encouragement that it shouldn't be a subject that's brushed under the carpet, that you can speak about it openly and lovingly.
Yes. Oh, Carol, you just put that so beautifully, much better than I ever could. And I'd just like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that, as you say, people will feel encouraged to go out and have some of these conversations and to explore this whole territory a bit more. And I'm always here, always happy to hear from anybody who wants to have that sort of conversation. So thank you so much for the chance to speak to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.